Carlos froze. His survival instinct told him to run. This part of the city wasn't safe for anyone, let alone a man carrying his entire life in a box. But the sound came again, a sound of pure, agonizing struggle. Carlos dropped his box. The few framed photos and office supplies spilled into the mud, but he didn't look back. He moved toward the shadows behind a dumpster. A man was lying there. He was dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Carlos made in a year, though it was ruined now. The pristine white shirt was soaked in a dark, spreading crimson stain. He had been stabbed, multiple times. "Hey," Carlos whispered, his voice trembling. He dropped to his knees in the grime. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyes fluttered open. Even in the dim light, they were piercing, a shade of storm cloud gray that looked dangerous even as they glazed over with shock. He tried to speak, but only a bubble of blood escaped his lips. "Don't talk," Carlos said, panic rising in his throat. He pressed his hands over the worst wound on the stranger's abdomen. The warmth of the blood was shocking against his freezing hands. "I'm going to get you help." The man gripped Carlos's wrist. His grip was weak, trembling, but desperate. He was terrified. For the first time all day, Carlos forgot about his own misery. The rejection, the firing, the homelessness, it all vanished. There was a life fading out right beneath his hands, and he refused to let death win tonight. "Help!" Carlos screamed, looking toward the street. "Someone help me." Nobody came. The alley remained silent except for the rain and the man's ragged breathing. "Okay," Carlos gritted his teeth. "Okay, I'm not leaving you." He hooked his arms under the stranger's shoulders. The man was heavy, dead weight, built of solid muscle. Carlos groaned, straining every fiber of his being as he dragged him toward the main road. His shoes slipped on the wet asphalt. His back screamed in protest. But he didn't stop. "Stay with me," Carlos panted, sweat mixing with the rain on his face. "Don't you dare close your eyes." Luck, or perhaps fate, finally intervened. A taxi turned the corner. Carlos threw himself in front of it, waving his blood-covered arms like a madman. The driver slammed on the brakes, cursing, but when he saw the blood, his face paled. "Hospital," Carlos commanded, his voice holding a steeliness he didn't know he possessed. "Now." The emergency room was a blur of fluorescent lights and shouting voices. Doctors swarmed the stretcher the moment they burst through the doors. Carlos was pushed aside, left standing near the entrance, his clothes stained with the stranger's blood. He watched them cut open the expensive suit, revealing a torso that looked like a war zone. "BP is dropping," a nurse shouted. "He's lost too much. We need O-negative stat. The blood bank is empty on O-neg, we're waiting for a transfer from St. Mary's." "He doesn't have time for a transfer," the doctor yelled back. "He's going into shock." Carlos stepped forward. The room went silent as he crossed the threshold. "I'm O-negative," he said clearly. The nurse looked at him, at his ragged clothes, his wet hair, the desperation in his eyes. "Sir, you need to go through screening, we can't just." "Look at him." Carlos pointed at the dying man. "He's bleeding out. I'm a universal donor. Take it. Take all of it." Minutes later, Carlos was in a chair next to the trauma bay, a thick needle taped into the crook of his arm. He wasn't watching the bag fill, he was watching the man. They had stabilized him enough to prep for surgery, but they needed the volume replacement immediately. Carlos felt a strange sensation as the blood left his body. It wasn't dizziness. It was connection. He watched the red liquid travel down the clear plastic tube, disappearing into the foreport on the stranger's arm. It was intimate in a way that made his breath hitch. His life force was leaving his veins and entering this man's body. He was literally pouring his warmth into the cold, dying vessel of a stranger. "I am keeping you alive," Carlos thought, a shiver running down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Part of me is becoming part of you." The stranger's face was clean now. He was undeniably beautiful, sharp jawline, dark hair swept back from a high forehead, eyelashes that cast long shadows on his pale cheeks. He looked powerful even in unconsciousness, like a sleeping king. "You're going to be okay," Carlos whispered to the glass partition separating them. He stayed for 2 hours. He watched the doctors wheel the man away to surgery. He waited until a nurse came out and told him the patient had stabilized, largely thanks to the immediate transfusion. "You saved his life," the nurse said softly, handing Carlos a cookie and a juice box. He would have died in that alley. Do you want to leave your name? So he can thank you? Carlos looked down at his blood-stained jeans. He thought of Gary's voice calling him dead weight. He thought of his empty bank account. This man was clearly wealthy. Important. If Carlos stayed, he would just be a beggar looking for a reward. He didn't want this act to be tainted by his own desperation. He wanted to be the hero just for tonight. Not the charity case. No, Carlos said quietly, standing up. His legs felt wobbly. No name. He looked toward the double doors where they had taken the stranger. He felt a phantom pull in his chest like a magnet trying to keep him there. He imagined just for a second what it would feel like to wake up next to someone like that. To be needed. To be essential. But the fantasy shattered under the harsh hospital lights. Take care of him, Carlos said. He turned and walked out of the automatic doors, back into the relentless rain. He was colder now, having given away his warmth, but as he curled up on a park bench hours later, shivering and alone, he touched the bandage on his inner arm. He had lost everything today. But he had saved someone. And in the silence of the city, Carlos closed his eyes and drifted into a restless sleep, dreaming of storm-gray eyes and the feeling of his blood rushing into another man's heart. 2 weeks. It had only been 14 days since the hospital, but to Carlos, it felt like 14 years. The city of glass and steel that he used to walk through with his head held high had chewed him up and spat him out. He wasn't Carlos the accountant anymore. He wasn't Carlos the fiancé. He was just a shape huddled in a doorway, a nuisance that pedestrians stepped over without looking down. Hunger was a constant, dull ache in his belly, sharp enough to keep him awake but not sharp enough to kill him. But the cold was worse. It seeped into his bones, making his joints stiff and his fingers numb. He sat on a flattened cardboard box behind a Thai restaurant on 4th Street. It was a good spot usually, the vents blew warm air, but tonight the wind was cruel. Carlos looked at his hands. They were grimy, the nails broken. He traced the faint blue bruise inside his elbow where the needle had been 2 weeks ago. That moment in the hospital felt like a hallucination now. Had he really saved a man's life? Had he really felt that spark of connection? Or was Gary right? Was he just useless? A shadow fell over him, blocking out the street lamp. Well, look at this, a rough voice sneered. I thought I told you this was our block. Carlos flinched, scrambling backward until his spine hit the brick wall. He looked up. 3 men stood there. He knew them, low-level street thugs who preyed on the homeless. They weren't organized criminals. They were hyenas looking for anyone weaker than themselves. I didn't have anywhere else to go, Carlos stammered, his voice raspy from disuse. Please. I don't have any money. You have a coat, the leader said, flicking a switchblade open. The metal glinted under the yellow light. And you're sitting in my warm spot. Terror, cold and liquid, flooded Carlos's veins. He was too weak to run. He hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. He tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him and he slumped back down. Please, Carlos whispered. The leader stepped forward, raising his boot. Begging doesn't work on me, trash. Carlos squeezed his eyes shut. He curled into a ball, wrapping his arms around his head, waiting for the impact. He thought of Gary. You're dead weight. He thought of the man in the hospital. I hope you lived. I hope at least one of us made it. He heard the boot scrape against the pavement. He braced himself. Screech. The sound of tires tearing against asphalt was deafening. It was close, too close. Bright, blinding white light flooded the alleyway, washing out the yellow street lamps. The roar of a powerful engine vibrated in Carlos's chest. The thug lowered his foot, shielding his eyes. What the hell? A matte black SUV had pulled onto the curb, blocking the alley entrance completely. It sat there like a beast, idling with a low, menacing growl. The doors didn't open immediately. The tinted windows revealed nothing. Move on, the thug shouted at the car, trying to regain his bravado. This is private business. The back door clicked open. The air in the alley seemed to drop 10 degrees. A pair of polished Italian leather shoes stepped onto the dirty pavement. Then a man rose to his full height. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin, tailored to emphasize broad shoulders and a narrow waist. He moved with a kind of fluid, dangerous grace, though there was a slight stiffness to his torso, as if he were guarding a healing wound. Carlos peeked through his fingers. He couldn't see the man's face clearly against the backlight of the car, but he felt the aura. It was suffocating. Heavy. The kind of presence that made the air feel thin. The thugs sensed it too. They stepped back, their knives suddenly looking like toys. "B-boss," the leader stammered, his face draining of color. The man in the suit didn't speak. He walked forward, his steps silent and deliberate. He stopped 2 feet from the thugs. He didn't look at Carlos. He looked only at the man holding the knife. "I wasn't aware," the man said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that vibrated with suppressed violence, "that the Heinnman territory allowed filth like you to harass the destitute." Heinnman. The name made the thugs tremble. Even Carlos knew that name. It was whispered in fear throughout the city. The Heinnman family ran the docks, the unions, and half the politicians. We didn't know you were in the area, Mr. Heinnman," the thug squeaked, dropping his knife. It clattered on the ground. "We were just moving this bum along." The man, Ricardo Heinnman, moved faster than Carlos could track. Smack. The sound of flesh hitting flesh echoed off the brick walls. The thug leader spun around and hit the ground hard, clutching a jaw that was likely fractured. Ricardo stood over him, adjusting his cufflink. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. And that was infinitely more terrifying. "Apologize," Ricardo said softly. "What?" the thug wheezed from the ground. To him, Ricardo gestured vaguely at Carlos without looking at him. "Apologize for breathing his air." "I'm sorry," the thug yelled, scrambling backward on his hands and feet like a crab. The other two were already running. "I'm sorry. We're leaving." "Go," Ricardo dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "If I see you on this street again, you won't walk away." They vanished into the night, leaving silence in their wake. Carlos sat frozen against the wall. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was saved, yes, but now he was alone with a monster far more dangerous than 3 street thugs. Ricardo Heinnman turned slowly. He looked down at the huddled figure in the dirt. His expression was cold, imperious, the face of a man who owned everything he saw. Then his gaze locked onto Carlos's face. Carlos saw the recognition hit him like a physical blow. The storm-gray eyes widened. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a shock so raw it cracked his mask. Carlos recognized him too. The pale face from the hospital pillow. The dying king. "It's you," Ricardo breathed. The coldness in his voice evaporated, replaced by a stunned reverence. Carlos tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He pushed himself up, trying to retreat, ashamed of his filth, ashamed that the man he saved was seeing him like this, broken and begging. I didn't ask for help," Carlos whispered, his pride flaring up even in his lowest moment. Ricardo took a step closer. He ignored the grime on the ground. He ignored the smell of the alley. He crouched down, ruining the crease of his $1,000 trousers, until he was eye level with Carlos. "You," Ricardo said again as if testing the word. He reached out, his hand hovering near Carlos's face, trembling slightly. "I have turned this city upside down looking for you." "Why?" Carlos managed to ask. "Because you left," Ricardo said simply. His eyes searched Carlos's face, cataloging every bruise, every smudge of dirt, every sign of the suffering he had endured. A muscle in Ricardo's jaw jumped, a flash of fury directed at the world that had let this happen. Ricardo stood up and extended a hand. It was a command, not an offer. "Get in the car." Carlos looked at the hand, then at the black SUV. "I'm dirty. I'll ruin the seats." "I can buy 1,000 cars," Ricardo said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming intimate and dark. "I cannot buy what you gave me." When Carlos didn't move, paralyzed by shock, Ricardo didn't snap. He didn't signal his driver. He bent down and hooked his arm under Carlos's armpit, helping him stand with a gentleness that was shocking coming from a man who had just broken a jaw with a single slap. "I can walk," Carlos mumbled, though he leaned heavily against Ricardo's solid warmth. "I know you can," Ricardo murmured near his ear. "But you don't have to." They reached the SUV. The driver, a mountain of a man, held the door open, staring straight ahead. Ricardo guided Carlos into the back seat. The interior was another world. It smelled of rich leather and expensive cologne, sandalwood and steel. The air was warm. The noise of the city was instantly cut off as the heavy door thudded shut. Ricardo slid in beside him. The space was tight. Ricardo sat close, too close. His thigh pressed against Carlos's leg, a line of heat that burned through Carlos's thin, dirty jeans. "Drive," Ricardo ordered. As the car began to move, gliding over the potholes that Carlos had slept on, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving Carlos shaking. He hugged his knees, trying to make himself small, trying not to touch the pristine leather. "Stop shaking," Ricardo said. It wasn't a rebuke, it was a plea. Ricardo reached into a compartment and pulled out a bottle of water and a protein bar. He opened the water and handed it to Carlos. Carlos drank greedily, water spilling down his chin. Ricardo watched him. He didn't look away. His gaze was heavy, magnetic. He watched Carlos's throat move as he swallowed, his eyes darkening. When the car hit a bump, Carlos swayed. Ricardo's hand shot out, steadying him, his palm large and warm on Carlos's thigh. He didn't remove it. Carlos froze, looking down at the hand. It was a possessive touch. Claiming, "I don't have money to pay you back for this ride," Carlos whispered, the old insecurity of his relationship with Gary bubbling up. "I have nothing." Ricardo turned his head. His face was inches from Carlos's. Carlos could see the flecks of silver in those gray eyes, the long lashes, the faint scar on his chin. "You gave me your blood," Ricardo said, his voice rough. "You poured your life into my veins when everyone else was watching me die. You think I want your money?" Ricardo's thumb brushed back and forth against the denim of Carlos's jeans. The rhythm was hypnotic. "Then what do you want?" Carlos asked, his breath hitching. Ricardo leaned in, invading Carlos's personal space until Carlos could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "To balance the scales," Ricardo whispered. "I owe you a life, Carlos. And I always pay my debts." Carlos's eyes widened. "How do you know my name?" "I didn't leave it." Ricardo smiled. It was a small, terrifying, beautiful smile. "I'm Ricardo Heinnman," he said. "I know everything I care to know. And right now, all I care about is you." The car sped up, whisking them away from the slums and toward the glittering skyline of the penthouse district, while Carlos sat trapped in the heated gaze of the most dangerous man in the city. Chapter 3, A House, a Job, and a Dangerous Attraction. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, and Carlos stepped onto marble floors so polished they reflected his dirty sneakers like a mirror. He stopped at the threshold, paralyzed. The space was cavernous, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire glittering city, modern art that looked like it cost more than Carlos's lifetime earnings, and furniture that looked too perfect to be sat on. It was a fortress of wealth, high above the grime of the streets he had just left. "Come," Ricardo said, walking past him as if he didn't notice Carlos dripping alley water onto the stone. "You're shivering." Ricardo shrugged off his suit jacket, tossing it carelessly onto a leather armchair. The movement pulled his white dress shirt tight across his chest, revealing the faint outline of bandages beneath. The reminder that this powerful man was still healing, still carrying Carlos's blood, made Carlos's mouth go dry. "I can't be here," Carlos whispered, hugging his arms around himself. "Ricardo, look at me. I smell like a dumpster. I don't belong in a place like this." Ricardo stopped. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "You belong where I say you belong." He walked over to a wall panel and pressed a button. Hidden lights dimmed to a warm amber glow, and the blinds began to descend, shutting out the city. "The guest bathroom is to the left," Ricardo said, his voice dropping to that low, rumbling register that seemed to vibrate in Carlos's chest. "There are fresh clothes, towels, hot water. Go." Carlos hesitated, then nodded. He walked into the bathroom, a space larger than his old bedroom, and locked the door. He stripped off the filthy clothes, peeling them away like a second skin. When he stepped into the shower, the hot water hit him like a physical blow. He stood there for a long time, watching the gray, soapy water swirl down the drain, taking the last 2 weeks of misery with it. He scrubbed his skin until it was pink and raw. When he finally turned off the water and stepped out, wrapped in a plush towel that felt like a cloud, he found a stack of clothes waiting on the vanity. Not a suit, but soft, gray sweatpants and a cashmere sweater. He dressed and stared at himself in the mirror. He looked thinner. His eyes were hollow. But he was clean. A knock sounded on the door. "Carlos." Ricardo's voice. "Dinner is ready." Carlos opened the door. Ricardo was waiting in the hallway. He had changed too, into dark slacks and a black turtleneck that accentuated the sharpness of his jaw. His eyes swept over Carlos, lingering on the damp curls of his hair, then dropping to where the soft sweater clung to his frame. The look wasn't just appraisal. It was hunger. Better, Ricardo murmured. He reached out and for a second Carlos thought he was going to pull him into a kiss. Instead, Ricardo's fingers brushed a wet lock of hair away from Carlos's forehead. The touch was electric, scorching Carlos's skin. You look human again. They ate at a long mahogany table. It wasn't a servant who brought the food. Ricardo had plated it himself. A simple steak, roasted vegetables, and warm bread. Carlos tried to eat slowly to be polite, but his body betrayed him. He devoured the food. Ricardo didn't eat. He just sat at the head of the table, swirling a glass of deep red wine, watching Carlos with an intensity that was almost unnerving. I have a proposition for you, Ricardo said, once Carlos had pushed the empty plate away. Carlos wiped his mouth, the reality of his situation settling back in. I'm listening. You were an accountant, Ricardo said. It wasn't a question. I had my team look into your history. Top of your class. Clean record. Fired because your manager needed a scapegoat for his own embezzlement. Carlos gripped the table edge. You investigated me? I investigate everyone who enters my orbit, Ricardo replied smoothly. My current financial team is competent, but they lack imagination. And more importantly, they lack loyalty. I need someone I can trust. Someone whose blood runs in my veins. He slid a black folder across the table. Work for me, Carlos. You'll manage the family's legitimate holdings. Real estate, shipping, investments. Starting salary is triple what you made before. Full benefits. Protection. Carlos looked at the folder. It was the answer to every prayer. Financial security. Revenge on the world that had discarded him. But he looked at Ricardo. He saw the coldness in the man's eyes when he spoke of business. He thought of the thugs in the alley, the fear they showed. He thought of the man stabbed in the dark. Is it just legitimate holdings? Carlos asked softly. Ricardo paused. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. The lines are often blurred, Carlos. You know what I am. Carlos closed his eyes. He could take the money. He could be safe. But he remembered his grandmother, a woman who scrubbed floors her whole life but walked with her head high because she owed nothing to anyone. He pushed the folder back. I can't, Carlos said. His voice shook but his eyes were steady. I can't be part of this life, Ricardo. I'm not. I'm not built for the shadows. I won't wash money that comes from hurting people. He waited for the explosion. He waited for Ricardo to throw him out, to tell him he was ungrateful, to drag him back to the alley. Instead, a slow smile spread across Ricardo's face. It wasn't mocking. It was triumphant. I knew it, Ricardo whispered. What? Carlos blinked. I knew you couldn't be bought. Ricardo stood up and walked around the table. He moved like a predator stalking prey, silent and focused. He stopped behind Carlos's chair. He leaned down, his hands gripping the back of the chair, trapping Carlos. His mouth was inches from Carlos's ear. Carlos could feel the heat of his body, the scent of sandalwood and wine enveloping him. If you had taken the job, Ricardo murmured, his breath ghosting over the sensitive skin of Carlos's neck, I would have been disappointed. I don't want an employee, Carlos. I have hundreds of those. Then what do you want? Carlos breathed, his heart hammering against his ribs. Ricardo didn't answer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. He dropped them onto the table in front of Carlos. 1402 Oak Street, Ricardo said. It's a small house in the suburbs. Quiet. Safe. It's fully furnished. The deed is already in your name. Carlos spun around in his chair to face him. I can't take a house, Ricardo. That's insane. I rejected the job. This isn't payment for a job, Ricardo said, his eyes darkening, dropping to Carlos's lips for a fraction of a second. This is a debt paid. You saved my life. A house is the least I can do. I can't repay you. I'm not asking you to. Ricardo stepped back, giving Carlos space, though the air between them still crackled with tension. There is also a bank account with enough to keep you going for a year while you find a job that suits your morals. Carlos stood up, clutching the keys. He felt overwhelmed, dizzy with the sudden shift in his reality. Why are you doing this? Ricardo looked at him and for a moment the mask slipped completely. Carlos saw something raw and terrifyingly possessive in those gray eyes. "Because the world broke you," Ricardo said softly. "And I intend to fix you." Ricardo walked him to the door. He didn't offer a ride. He had a car waiting downstairs to take Carlos to the new house. As Carlos stepped into the elevator, he turned back. Ricardo was standing in the center of the vast, lonely penthouse, looking like a dark prince in a glass tower. "Ricardo," Carlos said. "Thank you." Ricardo stepped forward, blocking the elevator doors from closing with one hand. He reached out with the other, his fingers grazing Carlos's lower back, pulling him just an inch closer. The touch burned through the cashmere. It was a possessive weight, a silent brand. "Sleep well, Carlos," Ricardo said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "Dream of me." The doors slid shut, breaking the spell. The house was perfect. It was a small bungalow with a porch, a blooming garden, and a kitchen that smelled of lemon polish. It was everything Carlos and Gary had talked about saving up for, given to him freely by a man who killed for a living. Carlos walked through the silent rooms. He touched the soft duvet on the bed. He opened the fridge and found it stocked with his favorite foods. He should have felt relieved. He should have felt safe. But as he lay in the big empty bed that night, listening to the wind in the trees, the silence felt wrong. It was too quiet. He closed his eyes and instantly he was back in the penthouse. He felt the phantom pressure of Ricardo's hand on his thigh in the car. He felt the heat of Ricardo's chest against his back in the dining room. He heard that dark velvety voice whispering, "No one hurts what's mine." Carlos tossed and turned, tangling his legs in the sheets. He was safe. He was free. He had a future again. But for the first time in his life, Carlos realized that safety wasn't enough. He touched his own neck, right where Ricardo's breath had hit him. His pulse jumped under his fingertips. He fell asleep with the keys clutched in his hand and he dreamed. He dreamed not of the house or the job or Gary. He dreamed of storm-gray eyes watching him from the dark. In the dream he wasn't running away from the danger. He was running toward it. He was running toward him. And when he woke up in the cold light of dawn, alone in his perfect new life, the first thing he felt was a crushing, inexplicable ache of missing a man he barely knew. Chapter 4, Gary returns and danger follows. For 2 weeks, Carlos floated in a fragile, suspended reality. The house on Oak Street was a sanctuary, smelling faintly of old wood and new hope. He spent his days applying for accounting jobs, tending to the small, overgrown garden, and trying to forget the terrifying magnetic pull of Ricardo Heinnman. He missed Ricardo. It was a bizarre, humiliating truth. He missed the suffocating warmth of the SUV, the sharp scent of cologne, and the way those terrifying gray eyes had made him feel solid, important. He was safe now, but the silence felt like a gaping wound where that dangerous, intense attention used to be. The fragile peace shattered with a notification tone late one evening. He was scrolling through his old social media feed looking for job contacts when a tagged post popped up. It was from Gary. The picture was a grainy, zoomed-in shot of Carlos's new house from the street, blurry but unmistakable. At Gary Vance. "Looks like my broke loser ex managed to run off with some serious criminal money. Funny how he dumped me and now he's living in a mansion. Be careful who you trust. This guy is a scammer and a thief who stole my savings and is probably hiding out with his new mob buddies. Hashtag thief, hashtag con artist, hashtag mob rat." A wave of nausea hit Carlos. It wasn't the lie that hurt, it was the public humiliation, the violation of his privacy, and the casual cruelty of Gary's words. Carlos blocked him instantly, but the messages started pouring in through other channels. Burner emails, texts from unknown numbers, and comments posted on the accounts of mutual friends. "You think you can just disappear? That house is mine. I know where you are, Carlos. You always come back when you realize you can't make it without me. They'll find out you're worthless eventually. I just hope you enjoy the ride down." Carlos began to spiral. He stopped answering phone calls, convinced every unknown number was Gary. He closed the blinds and spent hours in the dark, the familiar shame and self-doubt that Gary had instilled over years creeping back into his mind. He was unworthy of this gift, unworthy of safety, unworthy of anything good. He desperately wanted to call Ricardo to hear that authoritative voice promise protection, but the shame was a heavy weight. He didn't want Ricardo to see him as weak again. He needed to handle this on his own. He needed to prove he wasn't dead weight. But Ricardo Heinnman was not a man who trusted silence. Ricardo sat in his penthouse office, the city lights reflecting in the surface of his gleaming desk. The room was cold, minimalist, and unforgiving. He was looking at a screen filled with data points and surveillance reports, none of them about money laundering or rivals. They were all about Carlos. "Tell me what you have on Gary Vance," Ricardo ordered, his voice dangerously low. His chief of security, a nervous but efficient man named Marco, cleared his throat. "We ran a deep background, boss. Vance is a non-issue financially. Low-level debt, maxed-out credit, and a penchant for gambling. He owes money to a few heavy hitters on the south side, mostly legitimate bookies, but he's desperate." "The social media activity," Ricardo prompted, tapping his finger on the keyboard, bringing up the screenshots of Gary's vile posts. The words burned into Ricardo's eyes. "Useless. The dead weight." Ricardo hadn't just saved Carlos's life, he had given him a future. And this insignificant, jealous wretch was trying to tear down the foundation of the sanctuary Ricardo had built for his savior. It was an intolerable violation. "He's operating out of pure malice and desperation, boss," Marco confirmed. "He realized Carlos is living well and he wants a piece of the action or just revenge. We can have him handled in 12 hours. "No," Ricardo said, his gaze fixed on the screen, particularly at the cruel words Gary had directed at Carlos. "I want the debt collectors who are after him. I want his associates. I want to see the entire pathetic web of his misery. And then I want him to understand clearly and irrevocably that touching Carlos is an existential mistake." Ricardo leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together, the intensity of his possessiveness a physical weight in the room. He didn't want to hurt Carlos's ex out of revenge. He wanted to eliminate the psychological wound Gary represented. "Carlos is hiding this from me," Ricardo mused aloud. "He stopped engaging online 3 days ago, boss," Marco confirmed. "Exactly," Ricardo said, standing up. "He's closing himself off. He's retreating to a place where I cannot reach him. That is unacceptable." Carlos was in the kitchen of the Oak Street house, attempting to make soup, when the back door opened. He whirled around, dropping the ladle. Ricardo stood there, having bypassed the front door locks with the ease of a man who owned the house, regardless of the deed. He was wearing the same black turtleneck and slacks he had worn the day he gave Carlos the keys. He looked around the pristine kitchen, then his gaze settled on Carlos. He walked toward him slowly, silently, closing the distance between them until the island separated them. "You've been crying," Ricardo stated, his voice flat. Carlos instantly wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "No, I haven't. My eyes are just dry." "Don't lie to me," Ricardo ordered, and this time the command held an edge that cut through Carlos's weak defenses. He pulled his phone from his pocket and tossed it onto the counter. The screenshots of Gary's posts were displayed across the glass. Carlos's face flushed crimson with shame. "Ricardo, I was going to handle it. He's just desperate. I blocked him. He'll stop eventually." "He will stop when I break his fingers," Ricardo corrected, stepping around the island. He stopped directly in front of Carlos. The proximity was instant and overwhelming. The air became thick with that familiar sandalwood scent and the raw, unyielding power that emanated from Ricardo. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ricardo asked, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Because he was right," Carlos whispered, unable to meet the storm-gray gaze. "He was right when he said I'm useless. I let him hurt me for years. If I can't even handle a few stupid messages, how can I accept a house from you?" Ricardo's hands came up slowly. He didn't touch Carlos immediately. He cupped Carlos's jaw gently, his thumbs resting just beneath Carlos's ears, his touch surprisingly steady and warm. He tilted Carlos's head up until their eyes met. "Look at me," Ricardo commanded. Carlos looked. He saw not anger but a fierce, terrifying protectiveness. "Gary Vance is nothing," Ricardo said, his voice a low, gravelly promise. "He is a shadow of weakness, and he only tried to hurt you because he knew you saved a man stronger than he will ever be. He is jealous and he is irrelevant." Ricardo leaned in, their foreheads touching. Carlos's breath hitched in his throat. He could feel the strong rhythmic beat of Ricardo's heart, a heart that was pumping his blood. "You are not useless, Carlos," Ricardo breathed, his voice dropping to a seductive rasp. "You are essential. You are mine." He tightened his grip on Carlos's jaw, not painfully but possessively. No one hurts what's mine. The intensity of the moment was dizzying. Carlos's resistance melted away, replaced by a desperate, needy warmth. He wanted to close the final inch between them, to feel that possessive strength cover him completely. He wanted to be saved. But the word mine echoed in his head, a dangerous brand. He was terrified of giving up his last sliver of autonomy, even for this intoxicating safety. Carlos trembled, leaning into the touch, but unable to surrender the final part of his soul. I can't, Carlos started, his voice thick with unspent emotion. I don't. Ricardo pulled back, his eyes burning into Carlos's, acknowledging the invisible barrier Carlos had erected. He respected it, but his frustration was palpable. He took a step back, breaking the physical connection, but the promise hung heavy in the air, a silent vow that the calm was about to break. Sleep well tonight, Carlos, Ricardo said. Because by tomorrow, Gary Vance will cease to exist as a threat. Carlos watched him walk out the way he came, leaving Carlos stranded in his quiet kitchen, his jaw still burning where Ricardo's hands had been, the taste of safety and danger overwhelming his senses. He was protected, yes, but he was trapped by a love he couldn't yet accept, and a danger he couldn't yet see.
Hey everyone. Stick close. I will post the second part in a few hours. Don't forget to subscribe, and comment your thoughts. We are as much your fans as you are ours. Stay in the love.